Good evening, and welcome to the Discover Alaska Lecture Series. This is brought to you by UAF Summer Sessions and Lifelong Learning. My name is Althea St. Martin, and I'm your host for the series. Summer Sessions has a full lineup of free programs Monday through Thursday evenings at 7. This is the 16th season of Discover Alaska. In addition to our in-person audience here at the BP Design Theater, it is also live streamed and recorded, allowing us to take advantage of technology to show to a much wider audience. Later, you can review and share these lectures and all of Summer Sessions lecture series by going to the Summer Sessions website at uaf.edu/summer/events. Tonight, in addition to questions from our in-person audience, our online viewers can type questions for the presenter into the link at the bottom of your screen. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce the speaker, Knut Keilland. He is a professor of ecology at UAF's Institute of Arctic Biology and works in the development of sophisticated telemetric devices and associated analytical methods to allow biologists to learn about the ecology of many species in ways that were impossible even just a few years ago. Tonight, Knut will present the life history vignettes of two iconic species of the boreal forest, illustrating how much goes on in the woods when we're not looking. Here's Knut Keilland with The Hidden Life of Lynx and Snowshoe Hares. Knut?
Little rabbit foo-foo hopping through the forest, scooping up the field mice, pop mud ahead. I am delighted to be here tonight. I delighted to see you all, and I'm honored to be telling these stories about aspects of some of the research my students and I have been conducting over the last, close to 30 years, I guess. And looking at the audience here, I know many of you know a lot more about the boreal forest than I will ever. So what I will want to do is, and I know also that you are fairly familiar with the general topic here, these species and their interactions. So what I like to focus on is some of the lesser known and more recently discovered aspects of the lives of these animals that deals in with the lynx and the snowshoe hares. And first I want to acknowledge that this was not something that I've been doing on my own. I've been privileged to work with a variety of graduate students, some of which are listed here, that have been an integral part in documenting and revealing some of the secrets that we're going to talk about today. And in addition to being the beneficiary of the brain and bronze of these graduate students, I've also been very lucky to have some collaborators, some professional and some more sort of personal. Donna DeFalco with the National Park Service. On the left here has been an integral part of this research. And our friend up in Wiseman, Jack Rieckhoff, is another person that has been heavily involved in revealing natural history observations, sharing knowledge, and asking pointed questions about our interpretation of some of these patterns of interactions I'm going to talk about. So I want to start with the snowshoe hares. And many of you have probably seen pictures like this being out in the woods, the sign of snowshoe hares, both on the vegetation and with a prodigious amount of poop being produced after all this feeding. And as you know, snowshoe hares are primarily feeding on deciduous shrubs and trees in the wintertime. they consume upwards of perhaps 10% of their body weight. So they're pretty busy to putting it down the gullet. And like I said, there's quite a bit of poop coming out the other end. But interestingly, when there are lots of hares around, they tend to start competing for food resources. And these food resources have compounds in them that interfere with their digestion, and some of them are outright toxic. So they tend to diversify their diet. So they're not only, although they prefer, but not only eating deciduous shrubs and trees. They also end up eating conifers like white spruce and black spruce. And when there are lots of hares around, even though an individual hare will consume very little of a spruce, well, you multiply that little by a lot of hares, and then the spruces really take it in the shorts. And particularly if you have a situation where we have had what's called a mast year, that is a lot of cone production, a lot of seed production, and a new crop of spruce seedlings coming up. If that happened to coincide with the peak of the hare cycle, those spruce seedlings are going to take it in the shorts. The snowshoe hares are able to, in certain areas, pretty much wipe out an entire new cohort of spruce trees. And that's something we were not aware of earlier, but we have seen that through observations on part of the long-term ecological research program over 30 years, where we're seeing, for example, in the Tandem River floodplain, spruce coming up and then suddenly disappear, or we see that they've been chewed down by the snowshoe hares. So we've seen then that when there are lots of hares around, the browsing on spruce, which is not their preferred food, is nevertheless really heavy. And the idea that they can wipe out an entire cohort, that is pretty spectacular. So we see then that with lots of hares around, there are the growth rates of these young spruce and their survival rate or mortality rates really go up. And we're able to look at that and kind of curious, what are the ramifications for this happy coincidence for the bunnies, not so happy for the spruce, of their populations coming up together. And it was Albo Leopold in his Sand County Almanac that in a neat little essay called Good Oak, where he was talking about the browsing of rabbits on oak trees. And he says here, it's all too clear that every surviving oak is a product of either rabbit negligence or of rabbit scarcity. Someday, some patient botanist will draw a frequency curve of oak birth years and show that the curve humps every 10 years, each hump originating from a low in the 10-year rabbit cycle. That was his idea 70 years ago. And I'm here to tell you that we just did that on the backs of some graduate students, all right? But doing a retrospective population study of spruce here in our local environment, showing how the recruitment of spruce, not the preferred food item for bunnies, but nevertheless, are very much tied to the scarcity or abundance of these snowshoe hares. It's a little more complicated because what controls regeneration is, of course, a variety of factors. Not just the presence of bunnies, certainly, but there are the mast years, but also the weather pattern and a variety of other stochastic factors. So it's a little more muddled. But as you can see here, the humps in this regeneration cycle as a function here of the probability of a certain of these seedlings germinating with a low and a high in the cycle, they see this hump, showing that these animals have effects on the broader ecosystem, and particularly in such an important species as white spruce here in the boreal forest. Now, in order to understand more about that, so those were basically vegetation studies. We've been also looking at investigating the lives of snowshoe hares themselves. You can perhaps see it here on the screen, kind of hidden. We can't do aerial surveys on bunnies or do tracks in the snow. We ended up having to learn about them by capturing them. And we use little cage traps like this, baited with carrots and alfalfa cubes, bunny stuff. So each hare then we capture in the trap. We put in a little pillowcase, and then we can handle it. They're by nature of their personalities, they're very easy to treat. They just lie there quietly. Sometimes they bite us really good, but generally it goes just fine. And they get ear tags. We measure their hind feet, their mass, we sex them, and more recently putting on radio collars. But originally when we did this, and looking at the density of hares, here it is some old initial data when we started trying to figure out the survivorship. So here we have some density estimates from June 07 through the winter to the following June. As you can see, the densities increased over the summer from June to August 07, and then that's when of course the hares have their young, and then come August, no more reproduction, then it's just death and attrition. And during this period, then, there's a lot of death and attrition, it appears. The survivorship for these hares was like 18%, meaning, 80-some% went somewhere else. Who knows where they went? Whether they went just next door to our trapping grid or where they went to heaven. I don't know. But I know how to find out. And so next what we did was to put little radio collars on these hares. It weighs a little more than 20 grams, 2/3 of an ounce or so. And now we knew the fate of these animals. So they can go next door, but we know where they are, and we can find them, and we can know exactly where they are and if they live or die. I mean, I can generate some new data on their survival. And that took a lot of elbow grease. Here's my student, Dash Feierabend, who for 4 years, pretty much once a week, or maybe more than once a week, for 4 years, come rain or shine, 40 below, whatever, was out there checking on these animals, in part because we wanted to know, and I'm not going to talk about that in this talk, but what are the sources of mortality to these hares? Not merely how quickly they die. But as you can see from some of these initial estimates here, they were pretty similar to what we had from just our recapture rates. That, 80, sometimes close to 90% of the population dies over winter. If there are any population geneticists in the room, you will should take notice. This seemed to be rather a drastic occurrence for a population. For that, those kinds of rates of mortality and the possible genetic consequences for that. But so what is really interesting with these snowshoe hares is that you're probably well aware of the roughly 10-year cycle in abundance and scarcity. But what we're seeing from these kinds of data is that not only do we have this huge increase and decrease in their populations on the decadal scale, but that we have a miniature cycle within the year where they are increasing from hare J, June, to S, September, increasing over the summer, and then death and attrition over the winter. So it is this jagged seesaw up and down within the years, as well as on the longer decadal scale of their abundance. So this is a rather fascinating aspect of their population biology. And for a relatively large mammal, you would think that is amazing that there's not going to be more genetic challenges when you end up with mortalities like this on a regular basis. If we look at the overall mortality rates, or survival rates, flip side, you see that in some times of the year, here they are over the season, over several years of data, that there are some times that they are nearly immortal, like in July. These adult hares seem to suffer very little mortality. And then there are other times where they are indeed suffering a great deal of mortality. But it's not when it's like in the dead of winter. It's 50 below, and those pumpkins have to be out there eating 10% of their body weight to prevent from becoming furry ice cubes. No, there are other times of the year. They are, here you can see in April, May, there's serious attrition, probably due to a long winter. And there's also some reproductive behavior starting then that might take their vigilance away from predators, focusing on other things. And you also see it in the fall time. And there probably a concatenation of a variety of factors, such as going from a green food, herbaceous matter, into winter dormant twigs. So it's a reduction in the food quality. They're molting, they're growing a new winter coat. And also, from these population estimates, there are a lot of inexperienced hares now that are part of the population. Hares can have upwards of 3 litters per summer, perhaps 5 leverets in a litter, that's 15 hares. So they can increase their population sizes very rapidly. And that young cohort suffer disproportionate mortality. They just don't have the life experience. So you see this other dip again. Once they are weeded out, then the population survival go back up. These snowshoe hares, just like their rabbit cousins, breed like the latter. Here are just some embryos, as you can see here. That was dissected by a student of mine. And it was a snowshoe hare that died after he was in the trap and it was rolled around by a lynx, and finally the hare decided this succumbed to that. By the way, we had that happen a lot. And many a time, things are torn up, and these cages have been rolled around with a bunny inside, and we come there, and the bunny is a little bit shell-shocked, but otherwise, no worse for the wear. Very rarely have we ever had snowshoe hare that died from being tossed around by a lynx with the inside the trap, which is kind of remarkable. You would think at least one does at least die from just being scared, but no, they don't. But here we just see then these embryos. There's a size of 7, showing that they can have, from the normal 3 to 5, they can have 7, even 8 young during the high of the cycle, when food is still abundant and the population is on the upswing. Having a high reproductive capacity, that is one way then to counteract low survival for their population to persist. And in order to be able to reproduce, they have to have a reasonable body condition. In order to have a reasonable body condition, they have to have reasonable nutrition. And here's Claire Montgomery, one of my students, taking blood samples, looking at the nutritional ecology of these hares and looking at various biomarkers that might be associated with better or worse nutrition. But one aspect of hare nutrition that's been very interesting is that they, as I mentioned, they are eating food that are loaded with toxins and digestion inhibitors and such. And you might have seen this if you're out in the woods that where snowshoe hares have dug through the snow. And they get into this mineral soil and they eat it. It's known as geophagy. And that is very common in a variety of herbivores, but snowshoe hares really engage in this. And they come to these various mineral licks that are out about in the country. Here's a picture of one at night. They are getting from these minerals are several things. First of all, they get needed minerals in the form particularly of sodium. There's also clay in these minerals that bind the tannin, the digestion inhibitor compound in the plants. And thirdly, many of these soils are typically alkaline, and that counteracts acidosis, acidification of their blood as a consequence of ingesting these various secondary compounds. So there are three things, very critical things that these animals get from this behavior. And we can see that we've done some on captive hares, seeing that if they've got access to soil in their diet, then they're able to have a higher food intake, and that food intake results then in being able to maintain their weight much better than in the absence of any of this soil. So it's a critical resource. And we're curious how do they find these licks, and how do it shapes into where they generally spend their time. And here's some location data points of a snowshoe hare with a tiny little GPS collar. And much to my surprise, the hare's home range was right smack on top of this mineral lick. I thought perhaps they were living somewhere else, and then they walked over to the mineral lick, got their mineral soil, and then they hopped back to their sort of core area. But no, it's like many of them, it's right there. Now some of these mineral licks are fairly exposed. Some of them are right in the woods. There might be very dense vegetation, and some of them are more open. Some of them are like in here in this road cut north of Wiseman on the Hammond Road. And they are then vulnerable, of course. And they go to these licks, and it's not without danger, and they get picked off because certainly the predators, will be great horned owls or lynx, are well aware of these hotspots of bunnies. And they show up at these licks, not to eat dirt, but to find bunnies. So the idea of being concealed from predators by these animals, that is really critical. And they generally have a pattern of activity throughout the day of rest versus feeding. And these two requirements for life of getting food, that's important, but also not getting eaten by a predator, that's also important. Sometimes being engaged in one activity negates or makes you vulnerable to the other phenomenon. So what we found is that these animals tend to move between habitats if they happen to be in a general area where there are habitat fragmentations, like for example out in the Rose Creek burn, where you can have sharp delineation between thick black spruce and more open burns where there's an abundance of fireweed and other herbs in the summertime, and willows and aspen in the winter. And then they retreat then to the black spruce for resting. And here's some other data on habitat use based on these GPS collars, again here from Dash Fire Robin. And the black bars here are the black spruce, and let's say just the hatch area are the burned, to focus on that. And as you can see during the day, the hares are largely confined to the black spruce, where they're then resting throughout daylight. And then come nighttime, they're moving into the burn to feed. So for them, there's distinct areas then where they tend to feed and where they tend to rest. So just for the benefit of Ned Roselle, who is an avid reader, you're well familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes, right? It's time to sow and time to reap. And then, so we have added a little bit to that. That's in chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes. And in chapter 2 of Dashiell, we found out there's a place to eat and a place to sleep. So, you know, perhaps not as wise, but still something to pay attention to. We know that these hares go up and down, but the record of the oscillations in their in a population is not as well documented as that of the lynx, their main predator. It goes back to the famous records from the Hudson Bay Fur Company, of course, and here I just collated over the last 100 years or so, here in Alaska, of the numbers of lynx sealed by the state. And as you can see here, it's a remarkable periodicity to the abundance or the peak in the lynx populations, again corresponding to the ups and downs in the lynx cycle. And of course, the amplitude, the magnitude of these oscillations, well, they vary, but it's a remarkable period that this oscillation is having. And a few years ago, I started collaring both snowshoe hares and lynx as part of Bonanza Creek, long-term ecological research program. And that was kind of a one-man show. So now maybe 6 years ago, I reconnected with my Park Service bunny collaborator, Donna DeFalco, and we started collaring lynx up in the study area near Wiseman. And shortly thereafter, we had biologists from Fish and Wildlife Service interested in joining our research. So that became this Northwest Boreal Lynx project that we still got going. Fish and Wildlife Service and Park Service being sort of resource agencies, they were particularly interested in learning more about lynx movements and the connectivity between various landscape units, habitats. But there was also an opportunity with this enhanced funding and a lot of collaborators and different study sites across Alaska to look at more aspects of lynx ecology. And but the emphasis was on movement patterns and the connectivity stuff. But in the course of doing this, we found out all kinds of other things. No one had ever, prior to the LTR, hung a collar on a bunny in the state, and we were the first to put on GPS collars on these animals. And I had been well, for better or worse, a trapper for many years, so I kind of knew how to catch them. And I took, of course, familiar with the writings here of John Haynes, that I were able to put to words this sort of mystical feeling that these lynx emanate in me, and I'm sure in many of you. But just like with the snowshoe hares, we generally catch these animals here in cage traps. These are homemade traps made out of PVC pipe and chicken wire. But rather than carrots, we've got beaver tails in there. It works better for lynx. Lynx are not particularly concerned about human scent, which is handy. So we don't end up with foxes or wolves or anything coming into our traps. No, that's kind of handy. We end up with lynx. And their personalities, they're fairly docile. so they're easy to deal with. Some of them end up liking the bait we put in there and get fairly trap happy. This happened to be the first male actually caught in the Brooks Range study area. And I guess this idea that somehow white-winged scoters seem to be like, all right, I haven't had it before, but I like it. And we captured him more than 20 times. It was like, and it's interesting to see both with snowshoe hares and lynx actually, once they've been in that trap a few times and we've kind of gotten to know one another, they're just kind of, they're not too concerned. It's interesting. Some of you can kind of explain why that is, how they seem to act differently once they've been through the routine a few times. Anyway, we were kind of fond of him. All of us got a little tiresome to kick him out all the time. So this project then, both on the snowshoe hares, but now on the lynx, is up in the Middle Fork Valley of the Kaikuk, up there, Colfoot-Wiseman area. We have about roughly 100 kilometer along the haul road where we're doing these studies. And here's just an image of lynx territories sort of stacked up in the central Brooks Range. Different color, different lynxes. The red, pinkish are girls, of course, and the blue and green are boys. So, in contrast to, well, a bunch of other animals of this similar size, lynx have fairly short, small home ranges. They may be, well, roughly 40, 50 square kilometers, or let's be generous and call it, 5, 6 miles on the side. Yeah, that's it, and that's where they spend their time. But they are capable of making exploratory forays and stuff. But it's really, for an animal of that size, it moves at a fairly leisurely pace as a slow walk through its core area. And within that core area, there might be certain small areas within that area that are of certain interest. There seem to be these nodes of attraction that they often come to. And we are doing some mathematical analysis on how to describe and predict how they're moving around in their home ranges and what these nodes of attraction might be. Some of them are obviously places where they might be scent marking. They're also searching for food. Let's see if this thing works. This here is, there's Sukhopak Mountain here, and they're up on some of these ridges here, and that might be perhaps looking for ground squirrels. But there also are snowshoe hares way up there as well. But even though they have these fairly small, fairly well-described home ranges, they do take excursions. And here's just looking down an excursion path of 2 male lynx of this spring. The one in the blue there has been on the air for several years now. And then there's another one that's been on the air for a year. And they took off here in May and went down about 50 miles down the pike on the upper Chandler River, almost down to the east fork there, and then back again. Go figure. I thought they were just taking off, but no. And they were there at the same time. I'm trying not to make a little animation to find out if they were actually interacting, but more about that a little later. But they do this, and it's kind of a strange time of the year. These forays is often associated with breeding, and that'll be then in late March that they will make these excursions. So what those guys are up to, I don't know. Some of these longer movements are true dispersals. Again, some of them seem to be a sort of a certain path, but it's a little unclear whether the features of them in the country is funneling these lynx like you and I would be moving through the country. They're quadrupeds, and what might seem like a tough proposition to climb for us might be quite easy for them. But some of them can go a long ways, and the blue one here, he's actually now down in White River in the Yukon. And we have found through these collaring efforts a lot of information of where they are and where they go. And some of these excursions and movements have been associated both with true dispersals, like here in the blue here, and then in the same summer or spring, you see the red one here that was collared down on the lower Kayakuk River, went clear up to Arctic Village in the span of a summer. It's 400 kilometers as a crow flies. He must have calculated up all these little movements, and it was over 2,500 kilometers, something like that, in a span of 2.5 months. And he went up, and he came back, right back into his home range again. That little red blob you can see. Like, really? What was that all about? Huh? So, although there might, at least on the face of it, be certain corridors that might be associated with more likely dispersals, really these animals disperse in all kinds of directions. And they go crazy places. We had 2 females that we were really excited about, had collared, and I hope they were going to have kits last spring. I had a grad student over hot to trot to study some kitten development. Well, unfortunately, they took off. And you see one of them went clear down to around the mouth of the Yukon. And the other one went out to Kotzebue and over to Cape Krusenstern, wandered around Cape Krusenstern Lagoon down on the beach, and finally dropped her collar, which had a release in August. It had a little radio tag, and I convinced Park Service out in Kotzebue to go and see if they can find it. And in December, they got themselves out there, and they found it, sent it back to me. It's like, all right. They cost $1,500, these collars, so I'd like to get them back if I can. Anyway, one of the most extraordinary results from our lynx studies really has been to see the magnitude, the extent of these movements of lynx. Again, these are animals that typically hang around a few kilometers squared in their home range their whole lives. But at certain times, associated most likely with food availability, they start out. And why they are going, some of them, hundreds of miles, is still somewhat of a mystery. You would think that if you wanted to set up shop somewhere else, okay, you should be able to find something in the next 100 miles, don't you think? But some of them go. And they go all over, and they end up in radically different habitats from where they seemingly grew up. Of course, some of these animals, we got to know them when we collared them. We caught them first. Well, some of them were older individuals. They had a life before we met them. And perhaps some of the ones that, let's say, went to Canada. Well, they were just an expat. Now, heading back home anyway. We don't know. One of the things we're trying to nail down now is by taking, getting carcasses from trappers, and we extract a canine, and we can age it, but we can also get a chemical signature of some strontium isotopes in the annual rings of the tooth that we can look at relative to where this animal was trapped, and look at the various signatures of these isotopes in their teeth relative to a geologic map of isotopes, because that isotopic signature that has its origin in the geology, gets into the water, gets into the vegetation, gets into the herbivores, eventually get into a lynx. Then if there's a lynx that has an isotopic signature exactly the same from where it was caught, well, that's where it's been living its whole life. If it was a lynx, 8-year-old lynx, that'd be great. Then we might have 8 data points, and we can maybe retrace where it came from. So it's a really interesting opportunity to use these new techniques with these mass spectrometers, where we can extract samples on the weighs 50 microns with lasers, and get these samples and see if we can figure out where these animals actually came from without having had them collared. Anyway, that's a study in progress. Now let's get back to the Wiseman area. One of the interesting aspects of the lynx populations there, of course, is that they're living in a mountainous environment. Lynx are typically thought to be flatlanders. But in that area, there are mountaineers. Locals have been out sheep hunting, have run into lynx far above tree line. And we know that because of the Middle Fork Valley, for example, experienced a lot of cryoturbation due to the thawing of the permafrost, a lot of these debris slides, and that disturbance fosters growth of plants that have higher relative growth rates, such as shrubs, as you can see here in this image. So the lynx move in there because that's where the bunnies go. So you find lynx well above tree line in these brushy slopes, high off the valley floor. But you also find lynx, as I mentioned, that not just from people walking around the hills hunting sheep in Wiseman, but from our GPS data, again showing that these animals goes way up in the hills, climbing mountains. What do they do there? Well, they don't go for the scenery, I don't think. Although, you know, they don't speak English, so we don't give them too much credence for smarts, but we know that there's a lot more going on between their ears than we generally give them credit for. But they're up here, and there might be things like both bunnies, but on the very high up here, maybe ground squirrels, higher up yet. What do you think, Ned? Picas? Anything else?
Lambs.
Excuse me?
Lambs.
Lambs. There's Jack. He was a big guy, cruising up there during the lambing season. We don't have any documented information on them killing lambs in this area, but we know that lynx are capable, even though it's a small animal. Here in Alaska, actually killed caribou. So it's a possibility. But anyway, we see that they're moving way out of what we consider their typical habitat, and that is rather fascinating. Now, in addition to seeing where they go with locations, we can also, from our GPS information, make little animations. So we're going to see a green male here and a red female interacting. This is south of Coldfoot, as you can see. And there's another female, Missy. And as you can see, they're running around, and ooh, something happened there. I think it was a mating. Anyway, so these kinds of animations are sort of quaint, of course, but they do give some better visualization of how these animals are moving around and how they might be interacting. And this is then, of course, during breeding season. That's how I know that these encounters, and some of them perhaps, it looks like Marshall might have found another date over there. Anyway, they allow us to understand these interactions. And after we had some interaction like that, keeping track of the females, we might end up, after a couple of months, find these clusters of points around 1st of June, which is typically when they give birth. So this is now a denning female. And we've gone to these dens, and both we're interested in finding actually what kind of habitat they're in. As it turns out, they're often in very steep terrain. But also to get some idea about the reproductive capacity. And we're finding out that some of these animals can have really large litters. This one had 6 kittens, and we've found litters of 7 and even 8 a couple of times. Lynx are supposed to have 2 to 4 kittens. So here's an example of how when the food availability is high for these animals, they can really put it out. Like I mentioned, they are often high up off the valley floor. And like I mentioned, we found these litters to be pretty large. And we, across all the study areas, from the Fish and Wildlife Service as well as Park Service, we have tagged up roughly 100 kittens. And so we give them little air tags to keep track of them. And indeed, very few of them we see again. And I don't know their fate. Clearly, some of them died before they became adults. But others do. This spring, here 4 months ago, we caught a new lynx. Had air tags. Hey, yeah, we can find out when it was born, 2 years ago, and who its mother was. It survived. All right, good. Now, in addition to this keeping track of them, we can also, this information of knowing how many kittens they have helps us inform interpretations of other data we get. And when we try to answer things in ecology, or science in general, it's not just necessarily one approach or one piece of data that's kind of, oh, okay, I get it now. But there are provisional pieces of information that collectively gives us a better understanding. And this is one way to, something that illustrates that. So for example, knowing how many kittens a certain female had might help us inform or help us understand her movement. So here's a little GPS track of a female before she became a mother in April, May. Then day of year 150, that's June 1st. It looks like here we have a cluster, and indeed there's the den. As you can see, that cluster in the middle. This is a nursing period, the first 20 days. She's wandering around, hunting hares, eating them out, coming back to her den to nurse her kittens. Later on, she's now that the kittens are transitioning to solid food. So now there's no wandering around for the female, hang out with her friends, eat, and then go back to the nursery, but rather she's out, gets a food item for the kittens, and straight back. So you can see these lines, very different behavior. And we're now trying to model and figure out whether we can use this information of how often she is returning to the den with food related to how many kittens she has. trying to validate there because we got a bunch of data on females with different litter sizes and how did they behave when they were nursing and then during food provisioning period. Eventually, these things grow up, and by September, their mother and the kids are traveling around again in their home range. But this is an exciting possibility to be able to model and understand this food provisioning and visitation rates to the den to estimate whether you have a small litter or a larger litter. That has clearly management implications and is useful information for people that deal with this. Now, regarding pieces of information, GPS stuff, and some of these animations, and getting locations. But we also have a bunch of cameras out there. And one of the fascinating aspects of the ecology of lynx, which is considered a solitary animal outside the breeding season, is that we are getting data that suggests that they are actually interacting. So here's a peaceful interaction of a collared female, Uta, and an unknown male in midsummer. So here's one picture during July. Here's some other cameras, camera trap images of two known, male and a female, Goldie and Gary. We give them a name because it's easier to memorize that than serial numbers or IMEI numbers. They're 15 digits. No, can't do that. So here they are, and this is around Thanksgiving. The female in front here, the male in the back. They're goofing around. I got tons of these pictures, but I'm just going to show you three. Now they're just reversed. Now the male is in the front. They're both looking up at the camera. And again, this is the first time we really see that these opposite sexes no hanky-panky going on. They're just, I don't know, friends. I don't know how it works. But they are a lot more social. And we got all kinds of data on this than we give them credit for. And here's another example of that. These are two mature females, collared at different time periods, but all in the same year, but different locations. And this is down in Tetland, on the refuge. This is data from the Tetland crew. And again, as I mentioned, with these home ranges, the males have exclusive territories that they defend, within which they might have one or several females. So because eventually here they join up in November, and they're just pretty much almost tied at the hip. And this goes on for weeks that are together, and they clearly must be hunting together and staying together. And this, I'm not going to run it all through here, but it went into first week in February. So the idea then that these animals have a social life that we never gave them credit for, that is one other fascinating observation that has been made by, well, intruding upon their lives by hanging on these various sensors and stuff. But in my mind, I can weakly justify it because of it increases our understanding and I think also sort of reverence. Here's this chap we've seen or saw some data from him before. He was originally, I collared him in October of 2017. He's still on the air. He's carrying his third collar. And for me anyway, both regarding the Snowshoe Hares and the Lynx, I think one of the really rewarding experience is, of course, getting actually a better scientific understanding of their lives, but also to being sort of personally privy to what's been happening in their lives, whether they become parents or how they've been behaving and where they've been going. Some of that stuff is just so fascinating and a little bit sort of embarrassing that we're kind of spying on them in that way. But also, it really, to my mind, and having been a trapper for 20-some years, the idea of killing these things doesn't appeal to me anymore. But the idea of having to hold them like this and just seeing how their lives had unfolded has been incredibly rewarding. So I understand I'm out of time, and I just want to circle back here to the snowshoe hare. And just remind you in the context here that there they are. We can define them. They're small and frail, but tough as nails. Don't use nests or dens. They're active year-round. They survive on crummy food in the wintertime, in the coldest of temperatures. No care me, apparently. Pursued by a whole variety of predators that wants to off them. And they exhibit, as we've seen in the population data, nearly as high rates of mortality as birth rates, and yet they carry on. I think there is a lesson there somewhere, and I encourage you guys to contemplate it. Thank you much for your attention. Hi, Lori. Hey.
We're curious about the 1910 column of 20,000 lynx sealed. Is that accurate? And then since then, it's even a third of all of that for the subsequent years. What happened in 1910?
A lot of lynx. This is all from the Fish and Game. I just turned the tables into a graph and then added a few years more recently. Yeah.
But it's just so dramatic.
Yeah. Who knows what it was prior to that when we don't have the data for it. Yeah.
You didn't, or I didn't get the main attrition of snowshoe hares. I mean, obviously they die off quite a bit. 80% is high. Is that lynx? Or is it
Okay, so why do they? Right. Well, so predation is a main cause of mortality for these guys. They don't die of old age or boredom. They do starve to death. They do get diseased. They have accidents. You know, they make mistakes. Bad luck. But in general, 80 to 90% of the mortalities, probably more, are due to predators. But it's not just lynx. Although that is a main one here in Alaska. In parts of Yukon, coyotes are also important. But also, there are avian predators, great horned owls and goshawks. And they come without no scent, no warning from above. There's no learning involved dealing with those things. So that's a very but that's a topic of another talk, but we have all kinds of data. That's what Dash did his master's on and published several papers on the sources of mortality. And they are varied, and they vary by year, they vary by season. It's like super fascinating, but that's how they die, generally.
I was wondering if there any significant mortality from disease.
At times of the cycle, there is, they've been, whether it be beaver fever or rabbit fever, they certainly are getting subject to, for example, tularemia. But that is related also to, of course, their population density, transmission. So that is, at certain times of the cycle, might also be an important source of mortality. But overall, based on our collaring of hundreds of hares, Most of them, the ultimate cause of death is predation, but tularemia might indeed be a contributing factor to make them more vulnerable, just like being loss of energy or having some genetic effect, or being small versus a larger hare. That contributes to the ultimate factor. But so a variety of other conditions and attributes of these animals might, tip the scales in that direction.
I was really surprised by the extent to which the hares in the Tanana Valley relied on black spruce browsing. That was really remarkable, I thought. And I wondered if that contrasted with their food habits in the Coldfoot Hall Road area, if you had any information on, because of the different type of habitat, to what extent that pattern might have shifted.
They do, and we have, see, when there are lots of hares, the spruce gets browsed. But that, again, I think an individual hare is not making the bulk of the diet being spruce. But because there are lots of hares, a few nibbles by lots of hares ends up being heavy browsed on pretty much everything.
Well, follow-up question on that one. Spruce, we don't like eating spruce. Like when a needle gets in your oatmeal, we notice that pretty quickly. What value might they get from spruce? And do you know of any other creatures? What, the porcupine maybe, that might eat spruce?
Well, porcupines eat the sub-bark, the cambium, in between the dead outer bark and the xylem, the sapwood of spruce, as well as on deciduous trees. They don't eat a lot of needles. We know there are some animals, like spruce grouse, that pretty much live on spruce needles. And they have a physiology and a liver that can detoxify those various terpenes and camphor things that are in the needles. And I think that the snowshoe hares, do encounter a variety of nasty compounds in their diet. The tannins are the big ones because that reduces digestibility. They bind to the protein, and then they end up pooping out the protein rather than being assimilating it. But there are also plants, of course, that have toxins, about that from the birch, the little resin, the peperiferric acid, that's just shuts down the Krebs cycle, so that's not so good. But the spruce are loaded with a variety, and particularly with terpenes that are interfere with their homeostasis and physiological well-being. So, but even we kept hares captive and just feeding them their favorite food. No, they need to diversify the diet. They can't keep their diet up on a steady diet of just birch or a steady diet of just willows. Felt-leaf willow, a favorite food? No. They need to diversify.
The hares have this huge changes in population density. And I'm wondering if all the animals have that, or maybe the prey animals, but the amplitude would be proportional to the mortality range here, because you're telling us that this 80%, is that high for any mammals? The prey animals?
Well, it's a size-dependent phenomenon that is tied to their basic life history. So, for example, animals that have a high reproductive rates, they can sustain their populations, can sustain high mortality rates because they can come back. you can't do that with moose or caribou. They don't reproduce fast enough to have an 80% mortality rate. That would be kind of harsh. They can't bounce back. So smaller animals with high reproductive rates can do that. Porcupines are kind of also smallish, but a little bit bigger. They give birth to one young, not 15. So yeah, 80% mortality rate on porcupines. Those populations are going to disappear pretty quick. So it's a function then of their reproductive capacity. But for anyone though, the idea of having a 80% mortality rate sounds just outrageous.
I have a statement, I don't know if it's not a question, but I thought I've noticed that they actually modify their environment. I've noticed that white spruce trees that trim off the top won't eat it. It'll drop on the snow, and then in the spring that tree is pruned and it spreads out at the top, and the runs underneath are then covered by vegetation, so they have more cover. Whether that's, that's just an observation I made, but I don't know if it's a fact or not.
So are you talking about the snowshoe hares are modifying the growth form of the?
Correct.
In general, the browsing of hares on the spruce, depending on the size of the spruce, by the time they're 2 meters tall, they are kind of escaped out of the from hares. Prior to that, they're susceptible to death. But we know that other animals, like moose, foraging on winter browsing on willows, change the architecture completely because it changes the hormonal balance in the plant that determines to what extent lateral branches will grow or be suppressed through some hormonal action that are in the growing points, in the tips of the twigs. So the moose browse a terminal twig, for example, of a birch or in a willow, then that removes the suppressing action of this hormone on lateral twig growth, and suddenly you end up with this bushy thing that looks like a broom. It's called a brooming effect. And it changes the architecture completely. And there's also something called juvenile reversion when there's browsing on these deciduous shrubs, that they change their stem morphology. The mature willows that might look something like this. But they're browsed, they produce really long, straight shoots, and they are very different looking. And their leaf sizes are different, their chemistry is different, their growth rates are different. And if, for some of you, I'm sure you've probably seen it, that when moose have browsed some of these willows, for example, they can show this juvenile reversion and grow one stem really fast. I had one in my office that grew 8 feet. 8 feet over the summer. This is subarctic, apparently, isn't it? Or at least it used to be. That is like tropical growth, for heaven's sakes. So, yeah, the browsing by hares and moose can change how the plants go about allocating their resources in terms of the extent and how they grow.
Let's give a round of applause for hearing this.